Thank you so much, Professor Acharya. I want to start by thanking the 7th India Forum on China, the co-conveners, the Institute of Chinese Studies, Shivnadar University, and MITSOG for giving me the opportunity to speak at this forum. In terms of my own research, I look at China's nuclear weapons program, mainly from the prism of the nuclear politics of the Asia-Pacific region. So in that context, I'm going to speak on China's nuclear weapons buildup and its technological and geopolitical drivers. So ever since China tested its nuclear device in 1964, it has maintained an active nuclear weapons force in that it has actively and gradually over years expanded and modernized its nuclear systems, its missile systems, which it calls as its strategic forces. The Chinese have progressed from a 20 kiloton atomic bomb in 1964 to a hydrogen bomb in 1967 to a whole array of missile delivery systems, from your short-range missiles to medium-range, intermediate range, to long-range and even intercontinental range ballistic missiles. Of hundreds of thousands, of tens of thousands of kilometers of range. For instance, the DF-15 intercontinental ballistic missile is one of the most versatile missile that China has, and it has almost 3 variants, which is the DF-5A, B, and C. Currently, China has about 6 SSBMs, which is the nuclear-powered submarines in its arsenal. And these submarines deploy 2 kinds of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the JL-2 and JL-3. So China has been modernizing and expanding its nuclear force to develop missiles across different platforms, like its land-based missiles, its sea-based missiles, its air-launched missiles, which is essentially called a triad when it comes to nuclear forces. It has also developed technologies like multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, MIRVs, which is essentially a technology in which you can fit a single missile with multiple nuclear warheads, and they go and they launch missiles in different trajectories. The DF-41, which is a large ICBM of the Chinese, which they showcased at the 2019 National Day Parade, has a range of about 12,000 kilometers and is capable of carrying about 10 nuclear warheads at the same time. So China is essentially building, all platforms, an integrated missile defense system. They have counter-missile defense systems, anti-satellite systems, land attack cruise missiles, and are also developing what is called as the hypersonic glide vehicles. This is essentially a technology in which a warhead is fitted on a ballistic missile. It glides and maneuvers at a hypersonic speed, essentially changing trajectories and evading a missile defense system. This trajectory of China's nuclear buildup is not really very unusual. Most nuclear weapon states aspire to build a nuclear force which has a secure second strike capability, which is the ability to take a nuclear weapon strike and then retaliate with your own nuclear weapons, and to build a survivable nuclear force. And the Chinese also want to build a nuclear force which is survivable and credible in terms of its nuclear deterrence. But what has been more concerning in terms of the Chinese nuclear expansion is the exponential pace at which the Chinese nuclear forces have grown over the last 10 years, and especially since 2019-2020. Until 2019-2020, the estimates for China's nuclear weapons stockpile was at about 220 nuclear warheads in their stockpiles, which was more or less stagnant for many years. But then in 2024, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and the Federation of American Scientists, which are 2 agencies which study and assess and produce reports on the nuclear forces around the world, came up with a report saying that the Chinese nuclear warheads had increased to 440 in 2024, which means it had doubled only in 4 years. And this assessment goes on to say that if this trajectory continues, then by 2035, we could see a Chinese nuclear weapons arsenal of about 800 to 1,000 nuclear warheads, which is almost quadrupling, or 4 times the number of warheads which they have currently. So This is enough to raise alarm bells across many other countries, and especially for China's strategic competitor like the United States. Now, this rapid expansion of its nuclear forces seems to also break away from a traditional Chinese nuclear policy of maintaining a small nuclear arsenal with a no first use policy. And in 1996, China had announced that it would stop its its nuclear testing program. So, what really explains this Chinese nuclear weapons buildup? A lot of the analysis that comes out from the Western and especially the English language literature, more so from the US defense and military thinking, seems to assess that China's nuclear expansion has a very definite military objective to it. They seem to assess that China is abandoning its traditional policy of maintaining a small arsenal and unilaterally developing offensive capabilities to use nuclear weapons, and especially threaten the use of nuclear weapons against adversaries in conflicts where their core national security interests are concerned, for instance, Taiwan. Some also assess that the Chinese are also trying to counter and challenge the US technological developments and advancements. But Chinese experts, and especially non Chinese experts who have a close eye on China's military and defense programs, have a very different assessment of this. They believe that the Chinese modernization and expansion of its nuclear forces does not significantly indicate or even its behavior with regard to nuclear weapons. Um, the Chinese nuclear expansion and modernization is certainly rooted in the intensifying geopolitical competition with the United States. But what China really wants to do is to get a geopolitical leverage against what it considers as or perceives as threats from the United States. So it's very difficult to get your hands on the operational doctrines of China, as is the case with countries like India. But from the declared nuclear policy that we understand from the defense white papers, and the last one was published by China in 2019, or from certain official statements from Chinese officials and leadership, one gets to see that the Chinese leadership has not really assigned a military objective to any of its nuclear weapon systems. A lot of Chinese nuclear developments are in line with its technological ambitions. So what China is doing in terms of modernization is improving accuracy, reliability, range, the predictability of its nuclear forces. And all these are in line of its technological ambitions, but also very much in line with the larger objective of what it wants to make PLA into a world-class military by 2049. What we really see of the Chinese nuclear force expansion is that it is quite in line with trying to maintain a secure second strike capability, trying to enhance survivability. Even the debates that you see in the Chinese strategic community are around how to enhance assured retaliation. And none of this is really about building a first strike capability against the United States. A first strike capability is essentially a capability in which you can strike first at your adversary and take out the adversary's nuclear forces. And it's very difficult to get to a first strike capability. And China has been really concerned about the US missile defense. China has been very concerned about the nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities that the US is developing, which it thinks can interfere, intercept, and counter its own missile systems. The Chinese leadership believes that the US is building a nuclear first strike capability. It is lowering the threshold of its nuclear weapons and using its nuclear strategy to threaten and force strike, especially where its core interests are concerned, like Taiwan, South China Sea, or East China Sea. The growing US, Japan, Korea cooperation, especially in missile defense, the stationing of the US terminal high altitude air defense in South Korea in 2017, or the missile defense cooperation that the US is having with Australia or India, are all very concerning developments for China. Especially the collapse of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, if you've heard. The US withdrew from this treaty in 2019. This was a very serious concern for China, because what this treaty, abrogation of this treaty does, is it removes the limits on the range of nuclear weapons that the US can use and deploy from the Pacific, which are closer to the Chinese mainland. The Chinese are basically understanding all these developments as a way to weaken the Chinese nuclear reference
and so it feels the need to build a robust nuclear arsenal. And this in Beijing's understanding is rooted in the US's aim to maintain a global geopolitical dominance. If you see Chinese official and public opinion writings, they will all point to this, that the US refuses to accept China as an economic and geopolitical power. There is basically a deep mistrust of the US intentions, which prevents China from getting into any strategic dialogue with the United States. And this distrust is especially seen in President Xi Jinping's nuclear policy. President Xi, unlike his predecessors, looks at nuclear weapons as symbols of power. He looks at nuclear weapons as a significant geopolitical leverage against especially the United States. He looks at nuclear weapons as a means of influencing perceptions of other states to accept China's core national security interests and to respect China as a powerful state. Especially after 2019, following the pandemic and a lot of criticism and anti-China campaigns were launched, we see that President Xi almost called for the expansion of Chinese nuclear arsenal with a vengeance. He approved expanding the missile inventory, more silos to be built. He raised the PLA rocket force as an independent arm of, a separate arm of the PLA. The rocket force is basically the force which maintains the land-based nuclear missiles. He has expanded space-related activities, cyber-related activities, so a whole range of activities. This really is discussed in the US, which also comes from the Chinese understanding that the US has hegemonic arrogance and has illegitimate US interference in China's core national security interests. So what I do is I only conclude with a very significant incident that has happened very recently. In September this year, the Chinese PLA rocket force tested an ICBM, which went deep into the Pacific Ocean, about 11,800 kilometers. And this was most likely a nuclear-capable missile. The timing and the intention of this test has been very interesting. For the first time since 1980s, the Chinese have tested such kind of a missile into the Pacific Ocean. All other tests have been within its territory. Interestingly, this shows a changing pattern in how the rocket force is testing its nuclear-capable missiles, but also shows how the Pacific is now increasingly a ground for geopolitical contestation between the two countries. This test came almost 4 days after the quadrilateral security dialogue, the Quad dialogue. It came right after the US and Chinese military leaderships had met, so there was a strong signaling against the US. But it also shows that there is a domestic signaling that the Chinese are trying to do in terms of their nuclear modernization programs. We've seen over the past 2 years that a lot of reshuffling has happened in the PLA rocket force leadership. 2 commanders have been dismissed over the last 2 years. The PLA-RM has come under heavy investigation for several irregularities. So this test was also a signaling to its own domestic constituencies to keep faith in the PLA rocket force leadership and the nuclear command. Just to conclude, are we going to see a further expansion of Chinese nuclear forces? Yes, we are. But it's important to understand where this expansion is coming from. It's coming from a sense of vulnerability of the Chinese to the US developments, and it's also coming from their own technological ambitions. Thank you.